Hello and welcome to the Deviants Tour. Welcome to our Houston event. I am so excited because you are staring at three Texans all in one place, even though I think only one of us is actually in Texas. So before I get into the introductions and get to talk about our wonderful co-hosts, I do want to first take a moment to acknowledge the pain that our nation is feeling amidst the loss of Black lives at the hands of our nation's law enforcement. So, to any Black folks who are watching, your lives matter. To my predominantly white fans, we must do better. I've posted a link in the Crowdcast description for those who are hoping to make a difference for our friends who identify as QTPOC. In the meantime, please join me in a moment of silence to honor the lives of Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others. Thank you. I am now so excited to pass the speaking stick to someone who is representing a really, really crucial part of who we are as a country, which is independent bookshops. And from Brazos Bookstore, Cassie, thank you so much for having us.
No, thank you for reaching out to us and letting us be a part of this event. I am the events assistant for Brazos Bookstore. We are Houston's oldest independent bookstore, started in the 70s, and we host over 300 events a year. And yes, virtually, we are still doing that. So if you want to know anything that's going on in store, including Pride events, make sure you follow us on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and look at our website. Our events calendar is always getting something new. That's all I have for Brazos Bookstore.
I was supposed to have introduced our other co-hosts, so I'm sorry about that. In addition to Brazos, I also want to thank the in addition to Brazos, I want to thank the Gulf Coast Archive and Museum of Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender History. It's a large collection of artifacts and stories from the 50s to the present, focusing on the Texas Gulf Coast area. GCAM facilitates education and research for all interested about learning about the GLBTQ plus community. It will continue to tell stories and triumphs and struggles in our community for future generations. They are currently running a partnership with the Houston Health Museum in an ongoing exhibition called Outbreak, a history of pandemics through the ages, which you can read about on their website. Their donation link is also available on our description page, which is just that little I next to the Houston Eric Cervini in conversation with Alok. So please click it and support it. But otherwise, Cassie, I will give the speaking stick back to you again if you wrap up.
Absolutely. So first, I'm going to introduce our special guest for this event, Alok Vaid-Menon, pronouns they, them. They are a gender nonconforming writer and performance artist. Their distinctive style and poetic challenge to the gender binary have been internationally renowned. As a mixed media artist, Alok uses poetry, comedy, performance, lecture, sound art, fashion design, and self-portraiture to explore themes of gender, race, trauma, belonging, and the human condition. They are the author of Femme in Public and Beyond the Gender Binary, which came out yesterday. In 2019, they were selected as one of NBC's Pride 50 and Out Magazine's Out 100. They have presented their work at 500 venues in more than 40 countries. Alok, we are so glad to have you with us today.
Howdy, everyone. I was just waiting to say that. And I'm geeking out because I grew up in Brazos County, but we don't. You're being so everything Brazos. I was like, wow. We used to say, "Hey, everyone, my name's Alok. I use they them pronouns, and I'm from Brazos County, Texas."
I also have to, of course, introduce Eric Cervini, the award-winning historian of LGBTQ plus culture and politics. He graduated summa cum laude from Harvard College and received his PhD in history from the University of Cambridge, where he was a Gates Scholar. The Deviants' War is his first book. I think you have the talking stick.
I know. I wish we actually had one.
I know we could.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to stick you in the corner if that's okay. Sometimes I accidentally press the focus button and it just blows them up really, really big by accident, but I think I'm learning. Alok, thank you again for joining, especially now. I'm so glad that we can have this conversation.
Of course.
I wanted for people who may be watching, especially on Facebook, who maybe come from an older generation and have been through a lot, lived through the AIDS crisis, maybe lived through the Lavender Scare, and the concept of a gender binary is something new. So I'm wondering if you could first talk a little bit about what that is and why it's so important to know that concept.
For sure. I think I want to begin by saying that oftentimes the language that we use is new, but the expressions and the political sentiments have always been there. And even when you hear the phrase gay power that's used in the 70s and the late 60s, you read what groups like the Gay Liberation Front were actually expressing in their manifestos. And there was a challenge to the heterosexual gender system, right? So there were ways in which people were already thinking about this for a very long time, even way before that, but we'll go into that. So the gender binary basically is just a way to describe how we've come to divide billions of people into one of two oppositional categories of man and woman, male and female. The gender binary maintains that these categories have to be mutually exclusive, so you have to choose one or the other, and that they have to be in an antagonistic relationship, meaning that man has to be not woman, woman has to be not man, masculine and feminine are opposite. And so the gender binary is not actually a biological truth, it's a political and cultural construction that masquerades itself as biological fact.
Mm-hmm. And before I continue, I should have mentioned up front, anyone who may have a question for either of us, please don't hesitate to just type it in. There's a button that says ask a question. It won't interrupt us and we'll get to it in the latter half of the conversation. But I want to ask, in this moment, when all eyes are looking at Black Lives Matter and people like me, especially cis, white, gay men, why do you think it's important to still be cognizant of the gender binary that you speak about?
Well, I think it's really important to understand that what Black Lives Matter is doing is implementing what Angela Davis understands as radical, by which she says radical means grasping at the root causes. And what Black Lives Matter is actually provoking is that so many of the root causes of homophobia and transphobia lie in white supremacy and in anti-Black racism. And similarly, when a lot of Black feminists have been thinking through gender for decades, and this is inclusive of Black trans feminists, there's an understanding there that the colonial gender system, and by which I mean a gender system that was originally created in Europe and then forcibly imposed on racialized people across the world, that gender system is the root cause of homophobia, transphobia, sexism, and patriarchy. And so actually the freedoms that many white cis gay men have achieved have been conditional on performing straight cisgender norms and roles. So we're comfortable if you're gay, if you're masculine. We're comfortable if you're gay, if you're not too flamboyant. We're comfortable if you're gay, if you are in this kind of relationship configuration. And I see actually the work that a lot of trans and non-binary people are doing against the gender binary now as a continuation of a lot of the political critiques that were already there, like I said, in the gay liberation era, where I've done similar research that you have. And what I found is that in a lot of the debates in early gay activist circles, there was a debate between people who said the role of gay rights should be a feminist project and our natural allies are the women's movement. And then people who said, no, we're just making this about sexuality, shh, no conversation around gender. And what you actually saw was that a lot of the more effeminate, because that would be the term that they would use then, fairy or effeminate or queen, would actually say, hey, this is about gender, we should be able to look like whatever we want. And then those voices got silenced and kind of sacrificed in order for this iteration of acceptance. And one of the things that I point out in my book, Beyond the Gender Binary, is that acceptance shouldn't be conditional. We shouldn't have to say, okay, I'm going to give up on this segment of our population in order to be included. That's not really acceptance.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's so important that you bring up the term colonial, because I think that word is thrown around a lot when people say, oh, I'm, anti-colonial. But when you look at the history and you see that it's not just a buzzword, when you look at what the conquistadors who arrived in Latin America and in North America specifically, when you look at their letters back to Europe, what you see is not that they are setting the dogs loose on people for sodomy. They are setting the dogs loose, literally murdering people with dogs because they are transgressing European gender norms. And until that point, gender was not a binary in many, many native cultures across our continent and other continents. And it wasn't until the conquistadors arrived and practiced genocide upon that transgression of gender norms that you really start to see what we mean when we say colonial. Because and a lot of people, I think, also think to be non-binary or gender non-conforming is like a new concept.
Right.
And you read these accounts of two-spirit cultures where there are hundreds of traditions in different configurations of gender norms that went well beyond the binary, which is exactly what you write about.
Right. I mean, I have so much to say to this, so I will try to be brief. But if people really want like a lot more information, this is what I talk about and write about and read books about all the time. So you can follow me on Goodreads, actually, and I review a lot of academic writing on that intersection of colonization and gender. But one of the things that I want to bring up that really lands this point is the origin of the term missionary sex, right? Mm-hmm. Missionary sex actually came from when Spanish conquistadors would make Pueblo indigenous peoples actually come into the mission, the Christian colonial mission, and relearn how to have sex because they were seen as having sex as animals on all fours. And they were taught that the only way of having sex should be procreative. So therefore, missionary sex. Right? And so what a lot of people don't learn is that colonization was the process of teaching people, this is how you do gender and this is how you do sexuality. And so what that also looked like in what is now called the United States is making indigenous people go to residential schools where indigenous, quote, men had to chop off their hair and their braids and indigenous women had to cover their bare chests. And the reason that this is really important is because when you look at a lot of the early colonizing writing around the New Americas, is they would often use gender nonconformity as a way to depict like a wide brush on an entire community to be like, this is evidence that they are backwards and savage, which means that we are allowed to colonize them because it's seen as an act of benevolence, right? And so they would abstract particular visibility of gender nonconforming people to be endemic of the entire population. And the narrative would be, they're so degenerate, they allow this to happen, by which I say, I can only imagine what Black and brown people were feeling going into Europe, being like, they're so degenerate. They allow this repressed sexuality to happen. They're not even allowed to masturbate here. Oh my God. Like, it's really about like, let's reconsider what the crisis is. Mm-hmm. And I think when you're bringing up that point about non-binary is seen as new, I see this as also part of the project of colonization is erasing visible gender nonconformity such that the gender binary can posture itself as the only way to be. Because when there are not people like me in your field of vision, you're able to be like, well, you know, pretty much everyone fits into these categories of male and female. So we were erased from history. There's a really amazing book that I always bring up called Women with Mustaches, Men Without Beards. And it's basically, I think that's it, but it's basically about the history of gender and sexuality in pre-modern Iran. And what she basically says is that actually there was a deep kind of visual culture of gender nonconformity that got completely erased after European imperialism, because so much of what was happening was, in order to become modern, you had to be binary gendered and you had to be heteronormative. So the only kind of love story that is allowed is a man desiring a woman, even though for thousands of years in early Islamic art and ghazal art forms, there was actually a deep kind of homoeroticism that just completely erased from that cultural retelling. And so the implications of this are not just about the erasure of non-binary people. It's about the psyche around sexuality and gender for all of us, that we inherit this kind of garbage that cares more about these kind of mythological ideas of purity than the ways that we actually interact with the world.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's unfortunate, as someone who, I study primarily the pre-Stonewall gay rights movement, which is was called at the time the homophile movement. And you see time and time again, one of the chief aims of the movement was to differentiate the respectable homosexual from the transvestites or from, the screaming queens, to differentiate these suit-wearing white men from femininity. Mm-hmm. And I think, especially now, as we try to figure out what to do after marriage equality, I think when you read, and I hope that's something people get out of the Deviants War, when you read the words of people like Frank Kameny and Randy Wicker and these white male gay activists, even though they had good intentions of uplifting their community, they saw the threat of transgressing gender norms as being a hindrance to the movement. So you see time in there, some of them were more explicit than others. But what do you think that means about our obligation, especially for someone like me, who is benefiting from this legacy of exclusion? What do you think our job is now, especially this month in Pride and in the middle of this national reckoning that we're facing in racial relations?
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad that you're bringing this up, because so often I hear a lot of people give me a historical arc that says, there was a liberation era, then it became incorporated into this kind of assimilation. But actually, when you actually go back to the archive and you see what the kind of conversations people were having, a lot of the tensions that we have now were also being had there. And there was a conservative strain to the gay movement that became dominant, because actually there were dissenting voices. There have always been screaming queens across history, darling. Never forget it. In every country, in every language, and every geography, there's always been the people who are on the front lines for visibly gender nonconforming people like Sylvia Vera, who was arrested for the first time when she was 12 years old. And it's important to say that the reason people were getting arrested, by and large, was because of cross-dressing legislation. And that's been conveniently kind of erased from our recollections of Pride, is to actually say a lot of the drag queens, gender nonconforming people, trans people who started the Stonewall riots were protesting specifically cross-dressing legislation, which meant that they were being routinely thrown into prison simply for just existing in public. When Sylvia was thrown in prison for the first time when she was 12, it was female impersonation from the shoulders up. So they would literally create laws just to justify throwing people into prison. And so what I really want people to understand is the difference between tolerance and acceptance. Mm-hmm. Like, there's this myth that like cis gay men have equality, and I'm like, what? I don't see that. I feel like cis white gay men are tolerated, not accepted. And I think that there's been a defanging of gay politics. And so I just think it's confusing to me when even cis gay men were like, now that we've achieved equality, but I'm like, what equality are you talking about? After Donald Trump was elected, there was a series of hate crimes against cis white gay men in places like LA and places like Seattle. And I was sitting there being like, this is what happens when you don't listen to trans and gender nonconforming people. We don't have a movement that actually is responsive to anti-violence. what are we going to do? Call like legislators? Like when you are experiencing violence, you need to be able to have a shelter. Where are the shelters for queer people in this country? When you're in intimate partner violence and you need to leave your partner, where do you go when you're a queer person in this country? Where do you go when you're a queer homeless person in this country? Where do you go when you're a queer person experiencing hate violence on the street? The police became that. And so I think that's a really important moment to have a conversation about how actually the interest of the gay movement became less about gay people and more about the straight white police state. And I think that that's a history that I point back to you to ask. In your own research, did you notice kind of frictions around people who were saying, like, let's actually not, because at that time, right, we see a lot of policing of white cis gay people, of people saying we should not work in cahoots with the police, we should actually be skeptical of this, versus people who are like, no, they're our friends. Like, I really am curious about how we went from being outlaws to in-laws with policing in this country.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's so interesting that you bring up cross-dressing laws in particular, because those laws were around. It was technically, before I think 1967, it was technically a vagrancy law. And though that vagrancy law was first put on the books in New York, in the state of New York, in 1845, as a result not of cross-dressing, gender-bending, flaming queens, but because of farmers in upstate New York who were rioting against their landlords for seizing their property and exorbitant rent. And one way that they protected or concealed their identity was by dressing as women. And so that is where that law first...
And also by dressing as Native Americans to evade taxation.
Exactly. And so they were called, the Indians. It was the Indian law for a while. And then not until the turn of the century did it become a matter of saying, well, now that those riots are over, how can we use this law to start oppressing other more vulnerable groups, even though we don't have anything explicitly on the books against them? How do we make it about them? And so I think people forget that when we're talking about interconnected struggle, it's not just this idea that we have the same enemy. It's that we have an enemy that is willing to substitute one oppressed group for another, and it's the ones who have the least to lose, i.e. Sylvia and Marcia, who are the first to fight back and also the first to be forgotten. And so policing, there's always been a complicated relationship, because hand in hand with respectability, if you could get the police to respect you, then maybe that's okay. But the question is, who is really being respected and who is being forgotten? And so one of the biggest conflicts in the '69 Homophile Convention was whether or not activists should be thanking the police commissioner of Philadelphia for the previous protest that the Philadelphia Police Department allowed and gave them a permit. And of course, all the Gay Liberation Front activists say, are you fucking kidding me? You want to spend this moment when we have, this war, we have police brutality, we have people dying at the hands of police. You want to spend our time thanking them, and the resolution failed. They did not allow Frank Kameny to read that piece of that letter, and it became a matter of a larger struggle. But then, of course, you see the GAA and all these other groups that then say we need to only be focusing on gay rights, and people get forgotten.
I mean, every time I find these historical anecdotes, I'm like, that makes so much sense. And I think that's what the purpose of reading history is to really inform the present. I was just having an incredible conversation with a German historian who studies the Russian Revolution. And one of the points that she makes is we have this narration that things are always getting better, but actually there have been moments historically where things have been better, and we can learn from history. And I think that's especially the case when it comes to trans history. A lot of people don't know this, but in the early 1900s in the United States, there were actually many working class subcultures in New York City and Los Angeles where gender nonconforming and trans people were socially understood as women. And we actually have police records that show that when the police would go to profile sex workers, they would undergo anal examinations alongside examinations of vaginal examinations with an understanding that these people were just being penetrated, because the conception of gender and sex was actually more about sex role than it was about anything else, right? And that you actually see the development of a kind of transphobia that becomes nationalized later on in history. But I think that this brings up a point that I have always really wanted to elaborate, which is the relationship between classism and transphobia. That actually part of the way that we see the gay modern subject emerging throughout history is through this differentiation of gender nonconformity as the domain of sex work and the domain of like the illicit downtown, like the red light district, like it's like this like cheap thrills kind of thing. Whereas modernity and modernity, white class masculinity and femininity was through gender conformity. And a lot of that has to do with what we were talking about colonial gender. Colonial gender doesn't just sort of like begin, and a population has to be disciplined into it, right? And so one of the things that we actually see across history is that white people themselves were pushed into these categories of hypermasculinity and hyperfemininity as a way to prove and therefore further naturalize the gender binary. So one of the examples of this that I always bring up is white women removing their body hair. That only became a really major thing in this country with the influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe, Jewish women, Greek women. There was this fear of white suicide, or the idea that white Anglo-Saxons would lose their hegemony in the country. And so what happened is that they wanted white women to remove their body hair so there could be more of a visual marker of difference between white women and white men, so that they could show how advanced and civilized white culture was. And proving gender bifurcation has historically been a strategy of proving white supremacy. And that infects trans politics. When actually Black and brown trans people tried to go to gender clinics in the 1950s, they'd often be turned away because they would be told, your gender nonconformity is because you're Black or because you're brown, and we can't fix you. And in fact, when Christine Jorgensen and a lot of the early white transsexual women were able to get sexual reassignment surgeries, they did so through differentiating themselves from gender nonconforming drag queens. They would say, we're not like those street queens. We're not like those hookers. We are respectable heteros. And so respectability, often we need to actually unpack what that looks like. That looks like racial and class respectability. And so much of what we understand to be appropriate man and appropriate woman are actually racialized class aesthetics. And that when you look at working class white history, there's a different kind of genealogy of gender. When you look at Black history, there's a different kind of relationship of gender. And so that's why I think it's really important to locate our critiques historically, because so often people will dismiss trans and non-binary people as, you're just making this stuff up. And it's like, this is the same stuff they've been saying to us for hundreds of years. One of the things I wanted to bring up in this conversation, I've been thinking so much since we spoke, was a story that you told me about Sylvia Rivera actually being responsible for the legalization of gay marriage. And I think that's a really important moment right now to amplify, because so many white gay men are like, but what about pride? Like, can we get back to the real thing? And it's like, hey, actually the real thing is riots against police violence. The real thing actually is racial and economic justice. And I think that story really helps illustrate why.
And yeah, and that has been, if there's anything that I can like drill into white cis gay guys this June, it's that it's not just about Stonewall. It is the totality of pride as we know it that has been borrowed from the Black freedom movement. And we have concrete gay rights, including marriage, because of trans women of color. And so I'm sorry for repeating it, because I shared this story with you, but for people who may not know, Sylvia Rivera people usually associate her with Marsha P. Johnson or Stonewall, but I think to look around Stonewall, including what happened immediately after, is just as important, if not more so, because she was first, before she was working for STAR, Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, she was working under the auspices of the Gay Activists Alliance. The Gay Activists Alliance, one of its first initiatives was to be fighting for a city council bill for anti-discrimination, primarily in employment, in New York City. And they had a petition. Sylvia Rivera on April 15th, 1970, almost exactly 50 years ago, was standing on 42nd Street, garnering signatures for this gay bill. A police officer comes, arrests her solely because she's wearing makeup. It was scare drag, if anyone knows the term, at the time. And GAA had initially, after the Snake Pit riot, if anyone's familiar with that, they had a legal committee in order to sue NYPD. Until that moment, when Sylvia got arrested, she was the first GAA member ever to get arrested, the legal committee was defunct. They couldn't get lawyers. They had no real mechanism for getting incorporated as a real organization or for filing lawsuits. Sylvia shows up to court without an attorney. She finds an attorney in the courtroom who sees her dressed, fully as herself, wearing makeup, asks, "Why were you arrested?" She explains the situation. The attorney on the spot agrees to represent her, becomes the attorney for the Gay Activists Alliance, submits the articles of incorporation, which allow the GAA to function as a legitimate corporation in the state of New York. And in the meeting minutes in the New York Public Library, anyone can access them, you see the executive board of GAA saying that they were revamping, they were restarting the Legal Action Committee. They changed the name from Legal Committee to the Legal Action Committee in order to further defend Sylvia Rivera. That Legal Action Committee, 2 years later, spins off a new organization which is funded by the Legal Action Committee called Lambda Legal. Lambda Legal, 20 years later, becomes the first organization to join the marriage fight in Hawaii, one of many, but certainly one of the most indispensable organizations. And because of Lambda Legal, because of that attorney, Harold Weiner, but most importantly, because of Sylvia Rivera, we have gay marriage. We now have a moral obligation to fight for Sylvia because she was thrown out of the movement only a year after all of this happened. They stripped trans protections from the city council bill that she got arrested fighting for in 1974. She wasn't allowed to speak in the 73 Pride Parade. Anyone should go watch the video of her speaking. It is my moral obligation as a cis white gay man to declare that we have gay rights because of trans people of color, but also that Black trans lives matter, because who was number one beside her? Marsha P. Johnson, every step of the way.
I want to push this conversation even a little bit farther, because actually the term gay used to mean and signify very different things at different moments in time. And in so many ways, Sylvia and Marsha identified as gay. Mm-hmm. And there's this kind of historical amnesia where we've made trans to be necessarily a distinct kind of separate experience than being gay, but that's actually the product of political relations. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking here about works from like David Valentine, Imagining Transgender, actually showing how many visibly gender nonconforming people still, and especially gender nonconforming Black, Latinx, and POC folks, still use the word gay versus the vocabulary of trans, because there's different relationships with what that word means. And what a lot of people might not understand is that there was a series of political choices made where a largely gender conforming base of masculine gay men, and mostly just masculine gay men, basically said, okay, we are going to make this struggle about love and about sexuality and not about gender. There were people within gay politics and gay movements. And already we see this today with this kind of assumption that when we say gay community, we just mean cis people, even though trans people can be gay and can be bi and can be lesbian, right? There were actually gay activists who were fighting for gender justice and for the rejection of gender normativity, right? But those interests got lost because the success of the gay movement came from saying, we're just like you, not we're different from you. And we see various kind of complications of that with Queer Nation, with Moments in ACT UP, with the assertion of difference. But the most vehement assertion of difference in gay politics has always come from Black queer organizing. And I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge right now, is that across historical trajectories, it's been Black queer activists who have continually, one, not had the luxury to ever even fit into the kind of assimilation imperatives, but then two, a commitment, a poetic and political tradition of saying we are different and our strength comes from our difference. And what I read so much of assimilation within white gay history and politics is a desire to recuperate the power of whiteness. That actually what happens, and you read James Baldwin and he says this so articulately, where he talks about the psyche of a white gay man is they are resentful because they are not able to access white power. And so they're overcompensating so that they can achieve that. And what I see happening in the gay movement is a kind of racism that says we have lost power and we are being associated with those people. And what we see historically is instead of being like, we're associated with those people, that's amazing. I'd rather be associated with these people because they actually know how to have a good time. Instead, people say, no, I really want to associate with the people abusing me. And so I really want us all, as non-Black people in this moment, to actually recognize the ways in which there's a kind of purchase that comes from participating in anti-Black racism as a way to get this kind of virtual equality, as my aunt Urvashi Vad said, virtual equality into the sort of mainstream, but it is just a virtual equality because it is contingent on our differentiation from other populations. And so that's why I'm trying to, I guess, tease the very grammar with which we're having this debate to actually question, have we even achieved equality if it is conditional? Have we even achieved rights if they're incumbent on disavowals? I don't know if we have. And I think that now is a moment of reckoning where all of us actually do justice to what the legacy of this movement should have been and was and will be, which is a movement against policing, a movement against criminalization, a movement against police violence, a movement against state violence, a movement that actually says the state shouldn't get to allocate what appropriate gender and sexuality looks like. We get to make those decisions around our own bodies, how we present. We should be able to move around without fear of criminalization or harassment. These kind of core ideas of gay politics need to be resuscitated, which I guess leads me to my question for you, and I'm totally queering the interview format, so allow me.
I love it. I love this. Is perfect.
I guess I really have been thinking a lot about history, especially now, because what we're seeing right now is popular history. And a lot of us as history buffs get nervous when popular history happens because people lose nuance, they lose the actual kind of substance of it. But it's also really exciting to see people talk about history. And you're seeing this refrain of like, Black queer people or Black trans women are responsible for pride, blah, blah, blah. You're seeing a popular consciousness, Dua Lipa Instagramming Black Trans Lives Matter, like, is a moment that we're in right now, is that like the upper echelons of white straight culture are recognizing the contributions of Black trans people. That's incredible. And I guess I want to speak now about the role of a historian in the moment of social protest. Because I actually think that what I love about your project, and I'm just pushing by this book, Deviants War, is you're not writing this in an academic purview. And many of your contemporaries in gay history are writing in academia and writing largely inaccessible texts to people who are not trained in the lingua franca of the academy. What do you think is the importance of people's history? And how does that inform the ways that you're writing history? A desire for people who maybe wouldn't have seen themselves as part of like a public understanding history.
It's a great question, and I don't want to get in too much trouble for any historians who are watching, but I think gay
Now's the time for
historian.
getting in trouble, Eric.
I know,
Push it.
right? I know. Well, here's the thing. It's a new field, right? And there are elders in our community who literally created the field of queer history. And they had to go up against institutions, against dissertation committees, and prove to them that this was a valid field of inquiry. And I think one of the unintended side effects of that is that in order to prove that you're an academic field, you have to then adopt the trappings of academia and make a lot of the text, as you say, inaccessible. And I think making history human and including all the complexities of the human condition. Yes, I can write about Frank Kameny, but I also have to talk about some of the fucked up things he did, right? Whether it was being exclusionary, whether it was him getting violent with a lesbian activist, right? We have to start saying, yes, these stories are important, but let's bring in not just the human elements of their story and what they did wrong, but also start doing the hard work and saying, all right, I see a little instance, one word in Frank's papers about Sylvia Rivera. Let me check this other archive to see if there's anything more around this time about her. And doing the hard work of digging up these stories that are more difficult to form, because right now is the time. We need to be saying, okay, who else are we forgetting? And yes, we need to make history accessible and also be unwrapping some of the symbology, I think, of Stonewall. Yes, but it's okay if that's part of our mythology as a minority, but we also need to be looking at the concrete facts that we have gay rights because of trans women of color. It's not just that one moment that changed everything. Or started everything. It was the moment that changed everything and offered, I think, as you put it so well, this kind of glimmer of possibility of what a truly intersectional battle for liberation can look like, and then was lost.
And I'll just offer my own thoughts to the historians who are listening. I think now we have a social, political, and cultural imperative to liberate history. And what liberation of history actually looks like is, let's challenge the ways in which it's so hard for people to get access to archives about queer histories. Why the barriers people have going to an archive, say at Yale, and how we actually make history part of the public, how we're actually working with community organizations. I think it's so great that we have a community organization partner here to bring history to people versus thinking that people are going to come to history. And I really admire the ways in which you're bringing history into social media generation, because I really feel like in my own trajectory as a political thinker, as an activist, and as an artist, history makes me feel less lonely, and history makes me feel more possible. Because I know that there have been figures in history who have felt similar things that I'm feeling, different kinds of economies of exclusion, but that sense of being told you're ahead of your times. People have been told that forever. And so what I tell people, and people often get confused when I say this, like, how do you manage like the harassment you go through? I'm like, I read history, and history makes me feel part of something. And I think people really need to know that now, because the biggest arguments for all the politics that are percolating right now is history, is actually how initial gay activists were meeting with the Black Panthers, is the Black Panthers supporting gay liberation, which will undo so much of the priming that the gay movement has had, a racist priming that teaches us that Black people are somehow more homophobic or more transphobic. That is just not historically accurate. There's so many moments of solidarity and affinity, of Sylvia Rivera going with the Brown Berets, of Marsha P. Johnson working with the Black Panthers. So much of that moment can actually help contextualize the kind of formations and coalitions that can be created now.
Absolutely. I'm told we have some good questions. So I'm gonna bring Vivian back. Hello, Vivian. Are you there? She is. Okay, let's see if we can hear her. I'm toggling.
You are so masterful at this platform. I'm so impressed.
I was masterful, but now I can't. Vivian, can you toggle your mic? Because we can't hear you. Let me try. I am toggling the mic. Damn. All right, let's try one more time.
I just imagine there's going to be hours of reels of all the tech glitches of quarantine life.
I know. So I'm going to invite her back, but until then, let's see if there's a question for you. Here's a good one. How might unworking the rigid understanding of gender look like in different scenarios, e.g., coworkers, family, communities of faith, and ourselves? It's a great question.
Wow, that's a great plug for Purchase Beyond the Gender Binary, where you can actually learn. I think the first and foremost thing that we need to be aware of, especially locating this conversation in Texas, is there's an orchestrated effort right now in Texas to pass anti-trans legislation. Fortunately, a lot of these bills have been defeated, but literally in Texas, they were trying to pass a law that would give people a $2,000 reward for reporting if a trans person was using the restroom next to you. Like, we're literally talking about that level of orchestration in the past 5 years. And of course, people don't hear about these stories because when trans and gender nonconforming people are being targeted, it doesn't make mainstream media. So we need to familiarize ourselves with the status of anti-trans legislation in each one of our states. Equality Federation has an amazing map, which is actually mapping and tracking all of the anti-trans legislation in 2020. Familiarize yourself with them, call your legislatures, make sure that we are not legally defining sex as binary and sex as fixed. That's one step. And then the second step we can really do is every day I'm asking everyone, have one moment of protest of the gender binary. Is there something you were going to wear, but then you were like, oh, men or women don't wear that, I'm not going to do that. Is there something you were going to express, but then you're like, no, I'm afraid that people won't think I'm masculine or feminine, so I'm not going to express that. And do it anyways, because you get to define what man and woman mean to you, not some arbitrary set of parameters.
Am I working?
You're working.
Yeah.
Woo!
Yay! All right, I'm assuming you just answered the question about how to unwork the rigid understanding of gender, which was an awesome question. I wanted to add a little piece to that. I feel like you talked a lot, or you talked about like the structural ways in which we can fight back against the gender binary, which is super important, but also on an interpersonal level. I mean, I'm a high school teacher, and the things that my kids say are like, oh, I'm fine with gay people, but like the trannies, I can't do that. You know, just like stuff that is clearly very miseducated. How can we talk to people on an interpersonal level to help push back against that learned norm?
I just feel like all of this is the plug for my book, so I'm just saying thank you. So one of the things that I do in the book actually is the second section is just a list of the expletives that people say about us, the arguments that they use to justify discriminating against us. People are like, they're just snowflakes who are making up new words. And then I have actual language that you can use in the scenario to respond back to that. Because what I find is that there's many cis people who support us. They just don't know what to say when someone says, they're not real women. Well, and then that's where you can come in and say that. But I think one point I really want to get across is like, this is where we need everyone, regardless of your gender identity, to show up, because this is not actually just about persecution of trans and non-binary people, which it is. It's also about, is there dignity in living in a world where people say that kind of stuff? No. And so what I'm really trying to get people to realize, the thing about allyship is you don't just support us because you care about our community. You support us because you don't want to live in a world that facilitates cruelty. And actually, you also understand that you could have a kid, could have someone in your life who might be trans or gender nonconforming and not have disclosed to you, and that you yourself might have your gender transform over your life. Because what's happening right now is we're trying to fix the idea that gender and sex are set forever. And that's unambitious for everyone involved. I can't even decide what lipstick color I'm going to give in a day. The idea that I have one gender for the rest of my life, I can't.
Amen.
I love that. I definitely need to get your book.
And as a little bit of a plug for Alok's book, it's a pocket change series, right? That's what it's called. So it literally can fit in your pocket. And no matter what age you are, I will say that, you know, I'm a historian of queer culture, and I learned from this book. So you do not, even though it's a YA book, it's literally for anyone. It's a super fascinating and important read, and I think everyone should get it. And Alok, at some point, I want you to tell us about the campaign that you're running to be contributing the books to underserved communities as well.
Sure, I'll just do it right now. So we've partnered up with over 100 community organizations across the country, from Alabama to Wyoming, to distribute this book to LGBTQ young people for Pride, with an emphasis on states that have introduced anti-trans legislation. States like Idaho, which have passed 2 pieces of anti-trans legislation during the pandemic, targeting trans young people. So we've partnered up with youth groups to get books to these young people, because young people are having to have political conversations. They just don't have political education in schools. So I wanted this book to actually reach young people in school, so that when they're hearing things like that from their classmates, they don't even need to wait for the teacher to pop up, because they could be like, well, actually, blah, 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 blah. And so I think it's really important that we're devising new ways to support each other during Pride, because we can't come together in person. So I wanted to create a tangible way to. Last year, I really started to think about the legacy of Stonewall after 50 years. And I said, for the next 50 years, our emphasis needs to be on the South and the Midwest. That actually we have an urban East and West Coast movement. We need to be working with places like Missouri and Idaho and Iowa. And so this campaign came out of that. Like, how do I meet organizations in Iowa? And now I have this list of amazing orgs. If you're ever going through anywhere, I've got you now, Eric.
Oh my God, that's amazing. I don't know if you read the book. I'm blanking. It's Celia Lasky, Under the Rainbow. If anyone hasn't read it, it's about a queer organization going into the most homophobic town in all of America. It's fiction, in Kansas, and they're going to change hearts and minds. And it sounds almost exactly, even though it's a novel, it sounds almost exactly like what you're trying to accomplish. So thank you for doing that. And there's a link on the description of this page. If you click the little I next to Houston, it has Alok's book in very large letters, and I'll make sure it's also for our Facebook viewers that there's a link right there. Okay, sorry, Vivian.
No, that was great. I was going to say, like, as a high school teacher, I absolutely love that. Like, even as a teacher, I find myself, I often struggle with how to talk to students about the gender binary, because it's so mind-blowing for kids who are much younger and haven't had any exposure to that. So definitely we'll look to you as a resource. Thank you for writing that and for doing that project for young people. They need it. This is a question directed at Eric, but I really think it's for both of you. Both of you have great high levels of academic training, and you haven't, correct me if I'm wrong, gone on the academic job market, pursuing a position as an assistant professor or going for tenure, etc. Instead, you're publishing through a commercial press, going straight to the public. Can you speak to your goals and career plans and how you see yourself contributing to the intellectual life of the country outside of the university system, and maybe also why you chose to go that route? I think that's a really interesting question.
Oh, I love that question too, Eric. I have it too.
Ooh, okay. Do you want to go ahead? You go first.
No, I have that same question for you.
Oh.
Yeah.
I consider myself the Uber of history. I'm like getting rid of the middleman of academia and these hedge funds disguised as universities. I love the academic system. I was trained with it. I think it fulfills a very important purpose. However, I think what Alok was saying earlier about history being inaccessible is, especially now in this moment, is unforgivable. And I think every historian who may be watching has a moral obligation to start looking out of the academy and figuring out how can you tell stories and tell about your research in a consumable way that can actually reach the masses. So I'm in Los Angeles. I'll be the first to admit I am here because I recognized very early on that if you want to reach the most people to tell stories, then for better or for worse, Hollywood is the place to do it. So I'm very excited about some possibilities of making history a bit more accessible and telling other people's stories. One thing, I haven't announced it yet, but I should, just because it's tied to what you brought up, is I digitized about 100,000 documents for this book because I was writing it while in England, and so I only had very limited time in America to be doing my research. So the way I did it was digitizing all of these documents. They're now all online. I'm open sourcing all of the documents that form almost the entire backbone of the book. So if you want to start sleuthing for yourself and looking
I'm gonna
at
be
the
sleuthing.
documents, so just check out. It should be fully up and running. You guys can be my soft launch. It's called thedeviantsarchive.org. So check it out. It's supported by the revamped Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C., which is a 501c3 nonprofit. They're helping with like the hosting and all of that. So I highly recommend anyone who wants to kind of see the raw material for the book and maybe inspired to learn more about Sylvia and Marcia and Yvonne and Ernestine and these names who I wish I could have written entire books about. They deserve their own books, and
You still have time, babe. Like, give us those books because we need them. And I just want to really want to say hats off to you for doing this work, because it should not be exceptional. It should be what all people are doing, and it just baffles me. I mean, I speak and perform at universities all across the country and the world. When I meet some of the most incredible people doing the most incredible research, and I'm like, have you thought about ways to use technology to like communicate? And then they're just like, what? And it's like, actually, let's use technology to liberate history from the form of a traditional archive. And let's actually create new archives that are digital and accessible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's unfortunate. I mean, a big location of where a lot of my research came from was the New York Public Library in the Schwartzman building. And, you know, in order to use photographs, I mean, I love them to death. The archival division is great. But I think we need to be asking, you know, when Kayla Husin, who's 90 years old, was the photographer and the documentarian of the pre-Stonewall gay rights movement, when she donates her materials to a library for the public domain, and then this institution charges $450 in order to be able to use a photograph that an activist took in the 60s of people like Sylvia and Marcia. Mm-hmm. I think that's a shame. And I think we need to demand better of our institutions. Despite their best intentions, I think it's our responsibility as academics and as citizens and library card holders to start making those demands.
Mm-hmm.
Last question. I don't know why it said I was reconnecting. I could hear you the whole time. But it seems that we have a couple writers on, and they were just wondering if y'all could share a little bit about what your writing process was like. I think that's a big question that a lot of folks have.
Yeah. Hello, because I want to hear from you.
Sure. Procrastination, denial, anxiety, self-doubt, like existential angst and woes. It's extremely difficult to be a writer. And the thing is, for me, actually, poetry comes a lot easier to me than prose. And I've published poetry, I perform poetry. That's my most medium. If you hear me speak, I try to speak in poetry. But what I really wanted to do in this book is very similar to what Eric was doing, which is the majority of queer and trans theory right now is extremely post-structural and incredibly academic. And it has to do with that same kind of anxiety that you were alluding to of trying to prove legitimacy. But I really am concerned with that direction in the field. And so I wanted to take the ideas that were so incredibly profound to me being trained in gender studies and actually find a way to make them accessible. So writing this, I had to do like 10 different editions, because my first one would be the discursive, like ontological queer. And then I'd be like, what? Like what? And then I had to rewind it and be like, what is that? Like literally trying to get it down to a 12-year-old reading level is the best challenge for anyone. And anyone who's out here saying accessible work is easier work is foolish. Writing about complicated things in ways that a 12-year-old would understand was actually the best creative challenge. So shout out to my editors at Penguin Teen, who would just have back and forth with me and just flag this. What are you saying here? This isn't accessible. And one of the things that they really helped me realize is storytelling as theoretical work. They'd be like, do you have a story from your life that could help explain this idea. And often the ways that we're trained in academic writing is don't ever bring in your personal life, don't ever bring in what you've been through. But I actually want to say cross-pollinate, like actually draw from the theoretical work if it's helpful, draw from the personal storytelling if it's helpful, and come up with your own form of writing.
I couldn't have said it better. Yeah, shit.
I literally just ordered your book, Alok, on Amazon. Literally right now.
Thank you.
I should give a shout out also to, I think the one advice I would have for any writers who are watching is find mentors, and don't be shy to ask for help from people who have already made it. Whether if you're trying to get published with a trade press, make a cold call or cold email to an agent, right, who may represent some of your own heroes in the literary world, saying, hey, I have this writing, I have this dissertation that I wrote. Do you have any tips on making it better? That's how I got started. I sent my Harvard senior thesis to my literary agent, who was not my literary. I didn't have one at the time. I just, on a whim, on a bus, sent my senior thesis saying, hey, like, how do I turn this into a book?
Wait, there was enough data? Like, how on a bus sending it? Just, I'm impressed.
Yeah, it was a large Word file, and I sent it to a random, after Googling literary agent, top literary agents. I sent it to like a million people. One person responded. He's the person, Dan, if you're watching, who has ushered this book to completion. But the very first thing he said was, this is inaccessible, right? And so then I had to spend the next 4 years doing more research and making it a good story.
So this was a 4-year project?
4 years until I submitted the manuscript. So it's been 7 years of working on this. Yeah.
Wow. What a labor of love, Eric. Thank you. Like, really.
Well, thank you. I think we're out of time, Viv. Is that
Yes,
if there's any questions, I'll make sure we both have the Facebook link. So feel free to ask questions in the comments, and we'll try to get to them. But Alok, I'll never forget the first time I heard you speak live. You as a poet, as an artist, and as a thinker. Thank you for everything you do, and for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much, everyone, for having me.
Thank you, Vivian.